As usual, I'm Dave Robertson. Stalwarts of this series will have heard me introduce people before. And I have to start, for the first time, I have to start with an apology. I've been called away to a university meeting, so I will myself have to leave before the end of Holly's talk. But Serena Tricarico will pick up the questions at the end. So don't worry, Holly, you'll be in safe hands. That's all right. And I'm told we have potentially a record number of people attending this. So Holly, no pressure at all. I'm very jealous. You got better attendance than I did in the last one, so that's good. And I hope everybody can see the introductory slide. So you know the title. It's all about data linkage and the Salford lung study and what that means for asthma research. So Holly, if you could take it away, that would be great.
Yeah, great. So can everyone hear me? Yeah, brilliant. Yes, I'm going to be presenting today on a piece of work that I undertook as part of my PhD, but it's something I've been really excited about trying to disseminate as much as possible. And it's on the linkage of primary care prescribing records and pharmacy dispensing records, and using the Salford lung study. There we go. So first of all, one of the primary areas that I've been looking at in my own research is medication non-adherence. So that is not taking your medication in the manner that you have agreed with your healthcare provider. And measuring non-adherence or adherence from electronic health records is quite complicated, because obviously it's not something that's explicitly recorded in your primary care read codes. It needs to be estimated from prescribing and dispensing records. But ideally what you need is both of these records and for them to be linked together. If you have just the prescribing records, you can't tell if it's actually been collected from a pharmacy. And we know that this is known as primary non-adherence, sort of not collecting it at all. It's actually about 30% of initial asthma prescriptions nobody ever collects. And so then they're obviously not renewed and no treatment is ever initiated. And if you only have the dispensing records, you can't tell when they were being prescribed. So again, you can't see that other side of it that might be missing. And obviously there are limitations to measuring adherence from electronic health records. Like you can't actually tell if the medication has been taken or just collected, or if the technique is correct. We all know people that use their inhalers sort of all over their faces and aren't actually ingesting any of the medicine. But it's a great way to sort of estimate people's medication taking behaviors and just be able to see if their control problems might be due to not taking the medication as often as they should be. But there's a lot of barriers to looking at adherence from electronic health records. So in England, where this study was conducted, the prescribing and dispensing records are held by two different agencies. So the prescriptions are held by Public Health England, but the dispensing records, they're part of an administrative process for reimbursements for pharmacies. And so it's actually held by the NHS Business Services Authority. And these two datasets aren't designed to be linked together, so they don't actually have a common identifier. Like it'll say the person, and there'll be a lot of other information about it, but it won't match a single prescription to a single prescription. So there's no way of doing this deterministic one-to-one matching. In Scotland, where I'm based, fortunately, we have a system that facilitates a bit more easily the linkage between the two. But I think the situation in Wales is very similar. I've spoken to Ronan Lyons at Sale, and he says it has a similar problem linking the prescribing and dispensing records. And obviously that's a big problem. And I thought, well, let's give this a go and see if we can find some way of being able to link these two together using rule-based NLP, natural language processing, and see what we can come up with. So the aims of my project were to develop an algorithm for probabilistic linkage between prescribing and dispensing records, incorporating domain knowledge for asthma control and medications. So that's sort of knowledge about which medications are prescribed, what the strengths are, how the prescribing process works, common regimens, information like that. I wanted to try and evaluate the precision of this linkage in some way. Obviously, we don't have the golden truth, the sort of the underlying real linkage. And so we had to find other ways of evaluating as best we could whether or not the linkage was accurate. And we wanted to look at the traits associated with the risk of not collecting a prescribed medication. to compare these to the literature and see if our findings were in line with what other countries had found. So first of all, this is a little look at some of the information that is recorded in a prescribing or a dispensing record. You might have the subject ID, you know, that we've got the sort of de-identified CHI number, the personal index number, but you've also got free text relating to the drug description. You've got the date of the prescription or dispensing event. You might have the dose, the dosage instructions that were issued to the patient, and also some quantification of how much medication was given. But there's a lot of problems that will interact between these different data sets. So first of all, you might have been prescribed a brand named medication and dispensed a generic substitution. For a lot of medicines, this is, you know, that this is allowed, and the doctor might note that this is absolutely fine, or that they specifically want a brand name. The dates won't necessarily match because, I don't know about you, my doctor does not allow me to collect medications on the same day that they were prescribed. The pharmacy often requires you to wait a day. Some people might not be able to come in that day or the next day. It might be several days. After 6 months after a prescription has been issued, it becomes invalid and would have to be rewritten before it can be claimed. But so you've got a period of 6 months in which a medication could be collected. So obviously the dates between the two records could vary quite a lot. Here we've got that the dose is 50, and if you know the medication, you might know that that's 50 micrograms, but it could be 50 micrograms in one data set and 5 milliliters in another data set, and we have to find some way of working out whether these values are equivalent. We've also got typographical errors in the free text, but even more, the dose instructions tend to be written separately by both the prescribing and the dispensing parties. And so the text often just doesn't match at all, because the dose instructions might just say as directed on the on the dispensing record. And finally, there's a lot of discrepancy where sometimes the quantity is recorded as the number of units, the number of inhalers, or the number of packs of medicine, or it might say the number of doses, like an inhaler canister had 120 puffs, or a box of tablets had 30 tablets. And so you might have a 1 and a 30, and they're actually the same, but obviously they won't be perfectly matched. When we want to start processing these records to find out what's the same, we have to do a lot of cleaning. I was focusing specifically on asthma medications because I'd say we're incorporating so much domain knowledge. We want to really narrow it down when we're first starting this investigation. So I'm working on asthma medications. I searched through the drug descriptions for keywords relating to the medication ingredients and brand names, for example, Bambuterol or Airfluzol, which are an ingredient and a brand name respectively. We wanted to then match this to a lookup table that would match the combinations of brand name of ingredients and the brand names to one general key, a nice factor of just what the different treatments were. For example, Flutiform is a combination of fluticasone and formoterol inhaler. And then we wanted to obviously get rid of the prescriptions which were not asthma related. So like ibuprofen doesn't match any of the keywords that we were looking for, so we just ignored those for the time being. But also there are a lot of active ingredients and drugs that are prescribed for asthma, which are also for other conditions, because asthma is primarily treated with inhaled corticosteroids. But often the corticosteroid, for example, fluticasone, it's also available as a nasal spray, perhaps for rhinitis, or as an enema for Crohn's disease and things like that. There's a lot of other conditions. So we have to look for keywords related to the formulation or the description of how to take the medication to see whether it looked like it might belong to a different indication. So I was using the Salford lung study for this. So a massive data set, 4,233 participants with asthma taking part in this fantastic trial looking at regular maintenance inhaler therapy with inhaled corticosteroids, either alone or in combination with this long-acting reliever component. And one of the things that makes this trial different to a lot of other clinical trials is that the exclusion criteria were they were very small. They were trying to make this a really broad study that was very real world and pragmatic. So anyone that had a recent history of life-threatening asthma was excluded. COPD was excluded in case there was some overlap in diagnoses, and any concomitant life-threatening disease. But other than that, it was very broad and open, and people were continuing with their regular care. And so it's a great reflection of regular prescription records, but they're incredibly well maintained, which makes it really easy for me to start this investigation. So in this data set, we had just under 340,000 prescription records and 225 dispensing records. So you can see straight away that even if we managed to get perfect matching, a lot of these prescription records, the prescriptions were never dispensed. Once we'd narrowed this down to specifically asthma prescriptions, we had just under 89,000, and it's about 64,500. There were also quite a lot of these records that were either direct duplicates for reasons that are related to how the data set is stored and generated, or prescriptions that could be condensed into one prescription. For example, there might be the prescribing record says 2 different inhalers separately, whereas there's a dispensing record that just says it was 2. And so records were dispensed and duplicates were removed, and we ended up with just under 77,000 prescription records and 64,000 dispensing records. And I wanted to look, first of all, at all possible combinations of the dispensing records. So for each prescription record, matched it to any dispensing record for a person that was within the allowable time frame. And we came up with this 265,000 candidate, we called them candidate links, which then we wanted to conduct further investigations on to find the correct matches. And yes, there was a lot of variable recoding that was done into the different information stored in the records, like I showed in the previous table with the different features of the data set. So the medication class was assigned according to the active ingredients. So for example, if something was labeled as fluticasone formoterol rather than just the brand name. But this, so this was enabling generic substitutions to be still matched. There was a syntactic harmonization of the doses consistently to the microgram units. So if things were milligrams, they were converted, and the same for the milliliters, it was micrograms per milliliter. So we just worked out how many milliliters it was, how many micrograms it was in total. And there was also harmonization of the quantities to dose unit. So it was the number of puffs, for example, or the number of tablets. And we did this by doing some imputation of the most common number of doses per unit. So there's a couple of examples of the different translations that have been conducted here. And we wanted to include a sort of weighting system for these matches to help us narrow down before we started the backwards matching process. And so, sorry, I really nudged the table there, my big legs. So we've got 4 criteria on which matching was done. First of all, the brand name. And so we can see that it's sort of weighted 20% towards the brand name, 10% towards the dates, and then 35% for dose strength and medication quantity. And for brand name, the highest number of points was assigned if they had non-missing and matching brand names. And then it was half if it was 1 or 2 of them had a missing brand name, and so it couldn't be matched. Because missing data was quite prevalent in this data set, particularly in the dispensing records, which I'll come back to afterwards. Again, for the dose strength, the highest score was allocated if they had non-missing and matching dose strengths. For the quantity, it was if they had non-missing and matching quantities, but there were 2 other middle options between not matching and perfect matching. And this was because the quantity imputation was required for a really high percentage. I think it was 70% of the records. Something had to be imputed here because a lot of them were stored by the number of units. So we had to look at the medication and the strength and work out what the most likely value was of the number of doses per unit. And to make sure that this imputation wasn't having too much of an influence, we also allowed like a second best likely option. And so the matching could be done on the most likely option or the second most likely option with points allocated respectively. And the last one is for the date difference. If the dispensing occurred more than 1 month after the prescription, but obviously less than 6 months, because that is the point at which it becomes invalid, it was 0 points, whereas if it occurred within a month of the prescription, that was 10 points. We set a minimum weight threshold, so just the sum of the information had to be matching after this cleaning had been done. And that removed about 63,000 of the candidates. So there was still a lot that was within the time range that could be matching, which went on to the next stage of the evaluation. So how the linkage was done, we've got on the left-hand side in this little diagram, prescribing records, and on the right-hand side, the dispensing records. And the red line represents a possible candidate. So we can see at the bottom that the last prescribing record has only one candidate dispensing record, but that dispensing record could have belonged to one of 2 prescribing records. So we've gone backwards in time, starting with the last prescription, and we found the best match for the most recent dispensing prescription combination. And then we've severed any other links between those records. And then we've moved up to the next previous prescription. And we can see here that there are no further potential matches there after the other match had been taken out. So that one is an uncollected prescription. We move up to the previous one, find the match, move up to the previous one, and find the match. And at the end, we end up with this data set of our predicted matches between the prescriptions and the dispensing records. So after this process had been conducted, we were left with 53,000 approved matches, which meant that there were 23,000 unmatched prescribing records, which is around 70% of prescriptions were matched to a dispensing record, which was very in line with the rate that was observed in the literature of prescriptions not being collected. But on the other side, we can see that 83% of dispensings were matched to a prescription record. There are very few medications that can be dispensed without a prescription. We definitely expected this number to be higher. And so as one of our sort of data quality checks, we looked into this a bit more, and we'll come back to those later. But first, here's a plot showing the different distributions of these different points that were assigned during our waiting. And I think the one that is the most interesting, if we go into the bottom right corner, you can see the dates. There's a big difference there. So when the matches were made, the biggest determination really was that it was a very recent prescription. So it was quite uncommon for an approved match to occur more than a month after the prescription had been written, which, you know, logically makes sense of it. There's not a huge amount of people who collect their prescriptions that late. Most people would have just forgotten about it or decided not to collect it by that point. So that's well in line. And similarly, the variable that has the least difference between the sort of candidates and the approved matches was the brand name. It was quite common, relatively, that generics were dispensed in place of the brand name medications. So that wasn't a very strong deciding factor on the match. And that's just to remind you what these top categories meant. So I'll leave that on for a second. So as I said before, we found that 83.2% of the dispensing records could be matched to a prescription record. We had expected over 90% based on the literature. So we did a bit more of a deep dive into these unmatched prescribing records and found that just missing data in them was extremely prevalent. It was 62% of these unmatched records didn't have any dose information, and 58% didn't have any quantity information. And obviously that means that it's very hard to establish whether or not something is actually a match if that information is just missing. And just for comparison, when we looked at the unmatched prescribing records, it was like less than 2% for both of those. It was very uncommon that there was missing data in the prescribing records. It just tended to be the dispensing records really only contained the compulsory information. A lot of them were quite sparse. And so we can see that there's a major barrier at the moment to a successful and reliable linkage is the dispensing data just not being complete enough. as a little bit of a benchmark, a very, very naive benchmark, I conducted a deterministic benchmark analysis that was just with matching, perfect matching on the name, the dose, and the quantity. So I didn't include the free text stuff. As I said, there was typos, but also they were typed up by different people. And so it was very often missing in the dispensing data. But even just on these three variables, which you would expect to most likely be the same, we were only then able to match 15.4% of prescribing records and 21.2% of dispensing records. So this really does highlight how important it is that this syntactic harmonization is conducted and converting the different units and allowing variables to be very slightly different. That you really can't do a simple matching on this kind of data because there is just so much nuance and domain knowledge that is embedded into it. And so I think that was really fantastic for showing that we were definitely improving on that at the very least. Oh yes, so this is just a highlight before I'd said that it was very uncommon for prescriptions to be dispensed more than 1 month after they were written. So I did a little time to event analysis, and you can see here that really by about day 10, there is very little change after that. It's very few people are collecting it more than 10 days after the prescription was written. And it's 50% of people have collected it by day 3, which is very in line with the literature. It's something that is quite logical, but it's always good to check these things. And so we moved on to our survival analysis for the time to collection, which is very exciting. And we censored it based on that previous graph on 3 weeks after prescription. So we're looking at the factors associated with collecting it earlier and within the 3-week period. And there's a few things that we found that were highly significant and very in line with the literature. And that's first of all, that people tend to claim their prescriptions faster and more in springtime. And they did much less in summer and autumn. And a lot of people say that, this is because people have a lot of interaction between seasonal allergies and their prescription. A lot of people have allergic asthma. And so with these other symptoms being more common, people are going to be collecting them a bit better in spring. We also found that people were better at collecting the combination inhaled corticosteroid and this long-acting reliever compared to the steroid component by itself. And this is also well observed. People in other types of studies also found that adherence to this combination inhaler is typically better, because when people are getting their medication that keeps their symptoms under wrap, they're also getting this instant feeling of relief through the reliever component. And so it's there's much more of a instant gratification for taking that medication. And so than a standalone inhaler has been found to boost people taking the corticosteroid component of the inhaler. We also found that there's quite a consistent trend. If you have not collected a prescription in the past, you are quite likely to continue not taking it, which links back to a lot of the literature looking at primary non-adherence. It's not very often related to people forgetting to collect their medication. It is a sort of premeditated decision that they do not want to take the medication. Either they do not have the capability to collect or take the medication, or that they don't have the perceived benefit or the need for the medication, and so they will consistently not collect the medication. And I think your medication was the highest risk factor for the future. So to recap, our algorithm managed to find potential matches for 83% of our dispensing records. Missing data, especially related to the dose and the quantity, was a major determinant of whether or not a match was able to be made between prescription and dispensing records. And finally, the naive benchmarking showed that this integration of domain knowledge is really important if we're going to be conducting linkage in prescribing and dispensing records that are not designed to be linked together. That's me. I really rocketed through that.
Yes, you were very quick, Holly. Thank you very much. Right, so can I invite everybody, whoever has any questions, please raise your hand or have that to the chat. Sean has the question in the chat, Holly. So Sean is asking, the drug name, brand name, cleansing would not require if the DM plus D code is provided and the medicine can be matched to the DM plus D dictionary provided by the NHS BSA. Sorry, I'm not an expert here. I presume your data set didn't include these.
Yes, so the data set that I was using, didn't contain these. I think it contained the BNF codes, but they don't have the really specific information. They sort of, they relate to the brand name of medications. And also they don't have the dose information or anything like that. That's often available in the read codes, but we didn't have any of that in this data set. And I think it's the same in the Scottish data as well. I don't believe the prescription records are automatically linked to the read codes. It's just the BNF codes.
Sean, do you want to add anything? I can see you are.
So can you explain the Salford study, the extract for prescribing would come from GP practices. Is that from GPID then?
Yes, I think so.
And the dispensing, was that from, you gave the impression that that was from the process prescriptions from BSA, but was it an extract from the actual community pharmacies rather than the BSA data?
I'm not actually sure how it was extracted. This is the...
No, but what was the source of the extraction for the dispensing? Where did it come from?
I'm not sure, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay. So they are all relevant questions, I think, for this for the study, because the how do I explain it? The prescriptions are transferred from pharmacy to an NHS organisation who then take information from the prescriptions at the point of pricing. So there are actually 3 different sources of information. There's the GP practice prescribing record, there's the community pharmacy dispensing record, and then there's the NHS record of those prescriptions because they were processed for payment. And depending on where you have access to the data or what data you will have different levels of ability to link data, because the NHS prescription database also includes prescribing as well, depending on how they've set their prescription database up. That's different for each country, as you alluded to, Holly. So, and if you can get, depending on what data set you get to, will then determine how well your matching works on the work that you've done.
Yeah, so I think this is something I've discussed with other researchers from other parts of the UK as well as in Wales, and they said that sort of the combination of features that I had available to conduct this linkage is quite commonly what they are given within the research setting, and so I think it's it's good to conduct it just on this feature set rather than necessarily like a full super high security extraction or something, because you want it to be what's feasible for other researchers to conduct. And within the Scottish data that I have, there is a matching ID, but the actual features that are available in that data set are, again, the same as listed here. It's a lot of just free text. There's not a huge amount of structured data.
Thank you, Holly. Thanks, Sean. Alex, I can see you have your hand on.
Yes, thank you. This is a really interesting talk. I think somewhat relatedly to what Sean was saying. So this data is now linked, actually, at least for England, as part of the kind of the British Heart Foundation, as a COVID consortium. I kind of worked on this data set, doing something similar but with blood thinners. So I guess it would be interesting, actually, if you could get access to that data set to have it as a validation study, just to look across, because yeah, we do have IDs that link across those two now, and it's some important questions. So just good to kind of get that work aligned.
Yeah, that'd be great. I saw a question from Archie in the chat about
Yes.
selection bias from cases so during the study. I think this is a really interesting one. So we do see massive differences in adherence rates between countries, and a lot of that is due to the ease of getting medications. I guess contrary to what I would have expected, countries where you get prescriptions for free, such as Canada and Scotland, actually tend to see lower adherence rates. Or lower primary non-adherence rates. So people tend to collect their first prescription, but then they might not renew it so much. Whereas, sorry, my brain just absolutely froze for a moment. Whereas in countries like England, where you pay for your prescriptions, we tend to see people either sort of not collecting it ever or being quite rigorous with their renewals. In this particular study, people were actually reimbursed for their prescriptions. So I definitely expect that that might have influenced the adherence rates. But as it like overall, we just wanted to vaguely look at the adherence rates at the end just to see if there was any massive differences between the literature in comparable situations. So we were looking at other settings where people's prescriptions had been paid for. And it was just more generally to look at the feasibility of finding matches between these free text written pieces of information. But yes, I'd expect that this population would be quite different from a wider English population for sure.
Thanks, Holly. Archie, do you want to add anything? No?
Yeah, I was just interested in how people actually enrolled into the study and whether the fact that they'd shown enough interest in research into the asthma might make them different from other asthma cases who may be less inclined to be interested in taking part.
Yeah, and you know, asthma is just such a wide thing. There's a lot of people that have been formally diagnosed with asthma but would not consider themselves to have asthma, do not regularly take any controller medications. And so if we're considering kind of the control pool to be that whole group of people, then this group would definitely be people that are more engaged with their health and I guess consider themselves to have asthma, because they were continuing with the treatment throughout the entire study. Yeah, so but as I said, I tried to find rates for comparison between other sort of similar populations where it's people who sort of would self-define as having asthma, as well as not just sort of a historical diagnosis code that they no longer treat.
Right. So Mom has a comment on the previous point, the conversation between you and Sean. Sean, would that depend on year of study? Our previous year's codes now coding is NOMAD. Does that make any sense to you, Holly, Sean?
Yes, I was just doing an answer to Momi as we speak. Yes, it is relevant. SNOMED is replacing READ. There were READ-coded medicines in GPIT systems. The GPIT systems will be updated to use SNOMED. I think DMD is a subset of SNOMED. So this data linkage and this ability to, this requirement to use text, drug name description, quantity, all of that will be resolved with the greater use, the better use, and the more extensive use of the common SNOMED dictionary across all systems. Doesn't matter, we're not even primary care, we're talking HETMA as well in hospital settings. So that this will mean that the work that you've done, Holly, I hate to say it, but the work that you've done for matching for prescribing data will become obsolete. So I apologize for that.
I mean, I'm never sad about that, because if there's a better linkage available,
in theory, that will be resolved with better use of this drug dictionary that's supposed to be used universally across all systems. In the this is for the NHS that use prescribing medicines irrespective of the setting of that system.
I guess this could still be used for a lot of historical cohorts.
It could be used for all sorts of different, yeah.
I'll keep it in my heart. But yeah, no, it's fantastic that, you know, the sort of the way the data is being recorded for this is improving, because it's such a great resource, being able to measure adherence from, you know, such a wide population group with really just using secondary data is so useful. And it's such a shame that at the moment it is so difficult, and you know, the data sets just aren't set up for this kind of analysis. So a move towards better linkage, better estimation is just fantastic in my books.
Any other question from, please raise your hand. No? Yes, Sean.
No.
No? Right.
No, sorry. I was just posting my answer to
Mom, yes.
to Mom.
Right. So Holly, what's your next project?
I've recently finished my PhD, woohoo, and I'm now doing a postdoc at the University of Edinburgh. And I really enjoy doing sort of great free text work from electronic health records. And a lot of my work is on applying machine learning models to prescribing records and dispensing records and just general health records for asthma prediction. And I'm definitely trying to get into more of this NLP business. It's just so much fun. And hoping we can really harness these fantastic and incredibly in-depth records for great use.
I can see Sean wants to come in again.
Ollie, can we have a chat? I work in Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board, and we've done some work around this, and we're doing natural language processing of the dose instructions, and we're doing our adherence plots and visualizations and making them available to prescribers.
Fantastic, I'd love to talk more.
That's great. Okay, linking people. Right, I can't see any hand, unless Holly, you want to say anything else?
Oh no, just to say, I've seen you've got the little prompt up for the next talk by James.
Yes, sorry.
Very excited for that. He's
doing a bit of housekeeping. So yeah, the next one is James Lilly on predicting emergency admissions in Scotland, and it will be on the 22nd of September. So if you have not done so, please register. And Holly, thank you so much for your time and your presentation. This will go up on YouTube in a couple of weeks. So we will be famous, our faces will be on YouTube. Right. Thank you very much all for your time and for joining today. It was a pleasure, Holly, to host you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.